Hey John, how are you? I think you are muted.
Yes. Hello, Ian. How are you? Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Okay, good morning. Time now a minute past 9:30 a.m., which is 9:31 a.m. On the Thursday, June 22, 2023, in Japan Standard Time. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank online seminar. This morning, we are going to feature the Global Economic Prospect June 2023 edition. My name is Koichi Omori. I'm the Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. Today, the seminar is being co-organized with Asian Development Bank Institute, and on behalf of the World Bank Group, I would like to really express a sincere appreciation to John Byrne, who is from ADBI, with us as a commentator, but also allow us to make this event happen in the form of greater collaboration with the Asian Development Bank Institute. Thank you very much. Also, today we are having a simultaneous interpretation service being broadcasted through WebEx. On the YouTube screen, on the bottom of your YouTube screen in the left side, you see a little logo mark, looks like a Earth, or World Bank logo looks like, it says interpretation. If you click it and make choose of make your selection on the language, either Japanese or English, then you continuously hearing either languages. I will switch from time to time into Japanese, because we have also a Japanese participant who may submit a question in Japanese. So I'll read those questions directly. So for those of you who do not necessarily following Japanese language, please switch this language into English mode, so you'll be able to continue following. Now I'm switching to Japanese to share the same announcement with Japanese audience. おはようございます。世界銀行東京事務所の大森でございます。ただいまから、世界銀行の世界経済見通し2023年6月版に関するセミナーを開始いたします。今日は同時通訳を提供しておりまして、皆様の WebEx の画面の下のですね、左側にこの地球儀のロゴのようなマークがあると思います。で、これで日本語あるいは英語を選んでいただくことができます。それから質疑応答の際、もちろんこれは進行中に書き込んでいただいても構わないんですが、質疑応答の際、皆様からの質問を、ぜひどんどん出していただきたいと思っております。で、同じ WebEx の画面の、下の右の方に Q&A というセクションがあります。で、ここをクリックしていただいて、で、ぜひ質問をですね、どんどん出していただきたいと思います。で、その時に特定のパネリストだけでなくて、パネリスト全員ということで出していただけると大変ありがたいです。それから質問は日本語で書き込んでいただいても構いません。書き込んでいただいた日本語の質問を私読み上げますので、同時通訳の音声で相反、それからジョンに届きますので、日本語で質問を書き込んでいただいても構いません。ということで、どうぞよろしくお願いをいたします。また英語に戻ります。Okay. So this morning we have a pleasure of having Aihan Kose, who is our Deputy Chief Economist and the Director of the Prospect Group, who actually is, of course, the lead author of the Global Economic Prospect. Then Aihan is going to give us a snapshot of the latest edition of Global Economic Prospect for probably 35-40 minutes. Then we'll have John Byrne, who is a Vice Chair of the Research and Senior Research Fellow of the Asian Development Bank Institute, connecting with us today. sharing his comment on Ayhan's presentation and the Global Economic Prospect, the latest edition. And then I'll ask Ayhan to come in to share his immediate response to John. Then we'll open up a floor for Q&A. So if you have questions, please post your question on the Q&A section on the bottom right side of the WebEx screen, so that I'll read your questions on behalf of you and ask Ayhan and John probably to respond. So with that, I'd like to formally invite Ayhan to coming in to share his keynote presentation on the latest edition of the Global Economic Prospect June 2023 edition. Ayhan, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Koichi, and thank you, John, for joining us. It's great to be here in Tokyo, at least virtually. I'm hoping to visit the city I love sooner than later. And I'm very happy that a number of colleagues from different parts joining us today. I'm going to share some slides. We'll go over them quickly. Okay, I am hoping that everyone can see what I am showing. So, okay. So in the latest Global Economic Prospects report, again, we have 4 chapters. The first chapter looks at the global economy. The second chapter looks at the 6 regions the World Bank operates around the world. The analytical chapters focus on topical issues. The third chapter is about financial spillovers of rising US interest rates. And the fourth chapter, fiscal policy challenges in low-income countries. I'm going to talk about these analytical chapters as well, but I urge all of you to look at these chapters covering extremely important issues. I'm going to focus on 3 questions to basically summarize this big report. The first question: what are near-term prospects for the global economy? And the answer is that a sharp global slowdown is underway. The outlook clouded by multiple downside risks, in particular an intensification of financial stress. The second question: what are the main fiscal policy challenges in low-income countries? There is a large menu of challenges: rising debt, rising interest payments, larger fiscal deficits, and all of these happening while there is persistent revenue weakness and growing spending pressures. When you think about all of these challenges, there is limited fiscal space to support activity and invest for development and climate objectives in these countries. You know, later this week in Paris, global community will discuss how to think about development issues going forward. This chapter, of course, is focusing on low-income countries and raising the awareness of fiscal challenges they have been facing. With these 2 questions, and then the question, I think the third question, the natural one: what are the policy priorities? They're global and national policymakers. They need to work together in the short run to make sure financial and macroeconomic stability there to smooth the kind of the business cycle and turn the slowdown into a recovery. And then over the long run, the objective is that improving potential growth, addressing climate change, and basically putting the developing economies on a sustainable development path. Throughout the presentation, I'm going to use this acronym EMDEs, and that stands for Emerging Market and Developing Economies. So let me start with the first question: what are near-term prospects for the global economy? This is a kind of a crowded table. I'm going to try to make it easier for everyone to follow. And the presentation will be posted on the web page of the seminar after the seminar. So first big observation is that global growth is expected to slow down significantly this year, primarily because of the continued monetary policy tightening to rein in high inflation, and with that, more restrictive credit conditions. As you see here, we are expecting global growth to slow from 3.1% last year to 2.1% this year, before just edging up to 2.4% next year. Relative to our January global growth projections, we have an upgrade in 2023, but we downgraded the 2024 forecast. In fact, we downgraded forecast for 2024 advanced economies and emerging developing economies while upgrading for this year. There has been earlier in the year greater than expected resilience, especially in major economies, and that led to these upgrades. However, underlying these average annual growth numbers, there is a substantial slowdown in activity, and that has been taking place recently, and we believe it will continue be with us for the foreseeable future this year. So we will see activity slowing down around the world because of the lagged and ongoing effects of monetary policy tightening, persistent inflation, recent banking sector stress in the United States and, of course, Europe, and overall limited support from fiscal policy. So these factors are going to be a drag on activity heading into next year, leading to the downward revisions we have for the next year. In the context of advanced economies, we are expecting growth to slow down significantly from 2.6% last year to 0.7% this year. In the case of emerging market developing economies, the aggregate number suggests that these economies are going to see higher growth this year relative to last year. But this is mainly reflecting a rebound in China as China removed these, COVID-related restrictions. When you take out China, the picture for emerging market developing economies excluding China, is similar to the picture I described for advanced economies. We see a significant slowdown from 4.1% last year to 2.9% this year. As I explain later, the slowdown is even deeper in the context of emerging market developing economies that have elevated fiscal vulnerabilities and, of course, external financing needs. When we look at the big picture, I'm going to go back to this and put the growth numbers this year in a kind of a broader long-term context and compare those numbers, the numbers we saw prior to the pandemic in this millennium. As you'll see here, for the global economy, advanced economies, emerging developing economies excluding China, this year's growth, and of course, next year's growth will be lower than these different groups of countries delivered on average from 2010 to 2019. So the growth over the period 2010 to 19 was not satisfactory. And this year's growth and the next year's growth are going to be even lower than what those unsatisfactory outcomes we had. With respect to regions, two regions are, of course, doing better. In the case of East Asia and Pacific, because of the rebound we see in China, growth will pick up from 3.5% to 5.5%. And a number of countries in the region actually doing well. In the case of South Asia, growth stable is around 6%, thanks to strong performance of India. Other than that, when you look at Latin America, Caribbean, Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa, we will see weaker growth this year than last year. Europe and Central Asia is under the shadow of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Growth numbers are, of course, much lower than what the region delivered prior to the pandemic. So, again, how should we think about growth since 2020? And this figure is very telling. 2020 was a major global recession, the deepest one the global economy faced over the past 80 years. There was strong rebound in 2021. 22, growth slowed, and now 23, we will see even weaker growth. This is true for the global economy, this is true for advanced economies, and this is true for emerging developing economies, excluding China. Now, next year, recovery will be a tepid one. Even when we include the next year's recovery and look at these growth numbers across these four groups, lower than what these four groups delivered on average from 2010 to 19. So let me spend a little bit more time explaining these growth forecasts. The first observation is that where is growth coming from? And you see this on the left. Over the period 2010 to 19, around 25% of growth came from US and Euro area. And the contribution of China and India was around 40%. Of course, growth declined to 2.1% in 2023, then a little bit above 3% over the 2010-19 period. What happened is that China and India's role in explaining this growth increased significantly. So the China and India this year will account for around 57% of global growth, while US and Euro area together only around 19%. So the big engines of growth are China and India this year. Now, the other important observation about these forecasts, how forecasts are different, at least these revisions, depending on the extent of monetary tightening. For countries that tighten monetary policy more, we downgraded the forecast at a larger extent, as you see in the middle panel for 2023. The other important observation is that countries with lower credit ratings perform much weaker than what we expected a year ago in this year when we look at the figure on the right. So all in all, monetary policy tightening has an impact. That impact manifests itself on credit conditions and in turn on the growth numbers. Of course, when we think about this type of weak growth performance and insufficiency of growth, we need to think about how emerging market developing economies have been performing. Now we have our growth forecast all the way up to 2024. So we can look at how the growth performance over 2020 to 2024 compares with the non-overlapping periods since 1990. As you can see here on the left, the growth performance from 2020 to 2024 will be the weakest since the early 1990s over these non-overlapping 5-year periods. You might say, oh, we had the pandemic in 2020. Isn't this a normal outcome? But the global economy also experienced, of course, a global recession in 2009. and experienced a global recession in 1991 and experienced serious slowdowns in 97, 98 Asian financial crisis and 2001 when you think about the synchronized mini recessions in advanced economies. So pandemic plays an important role, but there is this overall weakness in growth, and that weakness translates into basically a historical weakness in growth performance over a 5-year period. In the middle panel, there is something striking when we think about per capita growth. Around 1/3 of emerging market developing economies will have per capita GDP in 2024 lower than what they had in 2019. This is not projected per capita GDP. It is, the level of per capita GDP. So the destruction of the pandemic will be seen in these economies per capita GDP 5 years after the pandemic. Now, over a longer time period, when you think about the performance of low-income countries, emerging developing economies, and emerging developing economies excluding China, and their ability to catch up with advanced economies, we see an outright stagnation in this convergence prospect, as you see on the right. Low-income countries, basically the income levels less than 2% of advanced economies. Emerging market developing economies, excluding China, around 9%, stagnating. China's performance, of course, pushes up the EMD convergence trajectory. But as soon as you take out China, the picture is quite disappointing. Against this background of growth challenges, there are multiple downside risks threatening the growth going forward. An important risk, of course, is financial stress that could be driven by further problems in banks or non-bank financial institutions, and that could be driven by persistent high inflation, pushing central banks even tighten monetary policy further. There are other types of risks threatening global economy, like geopolitical stress. It manifests itself in different forms, especially fragmentation of global economic networks we see in different parts of the world gaining momentum. Energy and food insecurity and social tensions could be local, but as well as global risks as we think about growth going forward. We have a big problem associated with climate and how climate-related weather events and disasters translating into weaker growth and large destruction in many emerging market developing economies. Beyond these, we are worrying about even weaker than what we are projecting in terms of long-term economic growth. So let me briefly talk about inflation and monetary policy and how we see things. Now, the good news is that after reaching more than 9%, global headline inflation has been coming down. We believe that this process will continue. Inflation will come down, but there is significant uncertainty around the trajectory we have. You see on the left, we are expecting by the end of 2024, inflation coming down basically close to 3%. But there is possibility inflation might surprise on the upside, especially when you look at the core inflation. It is quite stubborn, as you see in the middle panel, not just in emerging market developing economies, advanced economies as well. Of course, the stubborn high inflation led to the fastest tightening cycle we have seen, and the steepest since the early 1980s, as you see on the right. Now, one important feature of this tightening cycle, the US interest rate increases, Federal Reserve focused exclusively on inflation pressures. So there has been a clear pivot towards changing the Fed's reaction function to respond to inflationary developments. In the latest edition of the report, in chapter 3, we look at how this type of change in Fed's reaction function to types of shocks related to inflation, the real sector shocks, and what we call reaction shocks translate into different types of outcomes in the rest of the world. In the case of emerging market developing economies, these reaction shocks relating to Fed's hawkish pivot to inflationary developments lead to higher yields and higher spreads, especially in frontier market economies, as you see in the middle. When we look at emerging market developing economy space as a whole, the sovereign spreads higher than 10 percentage points. Fraction of countries basically experiencing these types of elevated spreads now close to 30%, which is one of the highest rates we have seen since 2000. Of course, when you have those types of spreads, that means you are effectively locked out of international financial markets. In other words, yes, we are not hearing emerging market economies feeling the pressure of interest rate rises as we used to see in the 80s and 90s and financial crisis. There are a large number of emerging developing economies, especially frontier markets, in some cases low-income countries, facing very high borrowing costs and in some cases unable to have access to finance in international markets. In the latest report, we look at different types of risk scenarios. These risk scenarios focus on tightening financial conditions. In one scenario, we look at what will happen if financial conditions tighten in advanced economies, and this is pretty much contained. In another scenario, we look at if financial conditions tighten and we see tightening around the world spreading emerging developing economies. As you see here, our 2024 growth forecast will decline significantly under these two risk scenarios, especially under the global stress scenario. Per capita global GDP growth would be basically negative, implying that intensification of financial stress associated with tighter financial conditions translate into a deep downturn worldwide. Growth in advanced economies will contract, so as a whole, this group would experience a recession, and growth in emerging market developing economies will be less than 2%, which is half of what we are expecting in our baseline. With that, let me turn to the second question. What are the main fiscal policy challenges in low-income countries? Low-income countries have chronic fiscal challenges. In the aggregate, when you look at the debt dynamics, you see significant deterioration of debt dynamics over a period of time. In 2011, low-income countries, low and middle-income countries, debt levels around same 33%. When we came to 2022, in the case of low-income countries, the amount of debt relative to GDP pretty much close to double. In the case of low middle-income countries, the number was lower than what we saw in low-income countries. With that, government net interest payments relative to government revenues increased significantly from close to 4% in 2010, larger than, 10% in 2022. And these numbers, the net interest payments relative to government revenues, tend to be much higher than other emerging market developing economies in the context of low-income countries. Now, the deterioration in debt dynamics, driven by, of course, weaker primary balances, and a large fraction of low-income countries, around 90%, saw their primary balance deteriorating from 2011 to 2022, which was a much larger fraction than other emerging market developing economies, as you see on the right. Now, when we look at fiscal deficits and revenues in these economies, we see striking numbers. Now, in the case of different categories contributions to primary balances, you see expenditures play a huge role when it comes to low-income countries. It's a big surprise? No, because the revenues are much lower in these economies than other emerging developing economies, and you don't see much of a progress when it comes to expanding the revenue base. And these countries rely on mainly, basically, the type of taxes we see, the personal income tax, the corporate income tax. But when it comes to indirect taxes, their performance is much weaker than other emerging market developing economies, as you see on the right. What about expenditures? They expand less relative to their GDP, the primary expenditures, when it comes to a comparison with other emerging developing economies. What is striking is that when it comes to education and health expenditures, these economies allocate a smaller fraction of their GDPs to these types of critical categories for their development than other emerging market developing economies, as you see in the middle panel. In terms of spending efficiency, we also found that the spending efficiency much weaker, statistically significantly weaker when it comes to multiple spending categories in low-income countries than other emerging market developing economies. Let me turn to the third question. What are the policy priorities? Here, let me briefly talk about challenges at the global level first. I talked about low-income countries. I'm going to continue an important observation in the context of climate for these economies. On the left, you see the fraction of people subject to natural disasters in low-income countries. And you see how from 2019 to 2022, fraction of populations has skyrocketed in these economies, especially fragile low-income countries. Of course, the droughts played an important role, and the droughts in Africa drove this outcome. But more and more, the problems associated with climate change affecting larger segments of societies in many countries. Some of these countries are like low-income countries with limited capacity to respond. And when we talk about, of course, food insecurity, there are multiple drivers of food insecurity, but one driver is these climatic events. Another important global challenge is related to debt of these economies. Landscape of debt has changed significantly. Now you see, in the context of emerging market developing economies, role of Paris Club shifting. And you see the bondholders playing a big role in emerging market developing economies, and non-Paris Club members, including China, of course, playing a big role. In 2015, only 5 low-income countries were in debt distress or high likelihood of debt distress. Now, that number increased to 14. This is half of low-income countries, basically. These economies need speedy debt relief. That's only possible if global community basically accelerates the functioning of existing frameworks we have, like the common framework, and addresses the challenges these economies are facing. As I already mentioned, these economies are already having significant fiscal challenges and allocating a small fraction of their GDPs for education and health expenditures. Development progress has been curtailed in these economies because of the mounting fiscal challenges, and now those fiscal challenges manifest themselves in debt payments. Another important global challenge relates to, of course, fragmentation of trade networks. As you see on the right, trade restricting measures has been increasing significantly since 2009, especially after 2016. These types of measures manifest themselves in different ways, but ultimately they are dampening the trade. Trade is already weak and affecting cross-border flows. Trade liberalizing measures relative to restricting measures growing, but at a much, much slower pace. We need to accelerate measures to facilitate cross-border trade, trade facilitation, and within national borders, policy interventions important, but global community has to also accelerate liberalizing trade and undertaking measures to make sure this important engine of growth is still making a significant contribution. Now, let me briefly talk about some critical policy priorities over the near term and the long term. So when it comes to global challenges, we need to find ways mitigating the downside risk, especially related to financial stress. That starts with implementing transparent, consistent, and credible monetary and financial policies. I already mentioned addressing debt problems in emerging developing economies, and especially low-income countries. Food insecurity, climate change will require global interventions. These are problems one might think with local outcomes, but they are global problems and they require global solutions. In this context, it's important to accelerate the energy transition. And of course, beyond these, we need to strengthen rules-based international order, the order that benefits all countries, to guard against the fragmentation of trade, investment, and financial networks. I already talked about monetary and financial policy challenges. These challenges will require rapid interventions, and fiscal policy challenges will require well-defined, clear, determined, medium-term programs to be undertaken. Now, beyond the short term, countries need to boost long-term growth prospects. At the beginning of the presentation, I showed that growth numbers are not just weak, they are weaker than what we saw even prior to the pandemic. We need to basically find ways to re-energize trade as an engine of growth, invest in information and communication technologies, so there is infrastructure to take advantage of these technologies. And of course, when it comes to services, we need to find ways to improve productivity of services sector. Investment has been chronically weak in many countries around the world. Strengthening investment especially in the context of climate-related infrastructure investment going to be critical going forward. We need to find ways to strengthen the resilience of societies and the resilience of the global economy to, of course, the health shocks and the climate shocks. And we need to improve overall inclusion. In some parts of the world, increasing the female labor force participation rate could result in significant growth dividends. In South Asia, in Middle East, North Africa, that has to be a priority. Let me summarize what I said. I asked 3 questions today. First, what are near-term prospects for the global economy? However you look at it, growth is slowing, and it's slowing very sharply. And there are multiple risks threatening the outlook this year. Second question I focused on, what are the main fiscal policy challenges in low-income countries? Challenges are large, impeding progress in development, and now translated into an outright debt crisis. What are the policy priorities was the third question. And that requires effort at the global level as well as national level. In the short run, stabilization of growth prospects by ensuring financial and macroeconomic stability, and in the long run, promoting potential growth, addressing climate change, and of course, having a sustainable development path. I'm inviting all of you to visit the Prospects Group webpage and take a look at our publications. In April, we released a major study on long-term growth prospects and how these prospects have been falling. This study comes with a comprehensive database of potential growth. And of course, we have many other studies looking at inflation, productivity, debt issues, commodity markets, and you can get a subscription our Global Monthly and our other serial publications. Let me thank again our Tokyo office inviting me to deliver this presentation. I look forward to the discussion. Back to you, Koichi.
Thank you very much. That was Ayhan Kosei, the Deputy Chief Economist and Director of the Prospect Group of the World Bank, summarizing the main outcome findings of the Global Economic Prospect June 2023 edition, which is the latest edition released earlier this month. Thank you very much, Ayhan. Now, I would like to invite the John Byrne coming in and then share his comment. John is apparently the Vice Chair of the Research and the Senior Research Fellow of the Asian Development Bank Institute, ADBI, based in Tokyo, kindly co-organizing this seminar. Thank you very much, John. I would like to invite you to come in to share your comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Koichi-san, and thank you very much, Ayhan, for an excellent presentation. I would like to provide some comments on the report itself, which will obviously be for future editions of the report. But firstly, let me provide some overview of the main focus of the report and basically what I see as the key findings before I provide some additional comments. So as Ayhan has very well outlined, the global economy faces significant challenges. We are seeing the impacts of tightening monetary policy slowly passing through. Of course, the US has increased interest rates by around 500 basis points since last March. And these interest rate rises have triggered interest rate rises in other parts of the world as well. Emerging market economies have also, reacted in terms of their own monetary policy. And this had impacts, of course, on the cost of sovereign borrowing and implications for growth developments in these economies. And the broad context for the report, I think, is to understand the risks that economies face in this tightened period of global financial conditions, and to understand the risks that may, trigger sort of a hard landing versus policies that can be implemented to mitigate the extent of these risks. So the report very well outlines these issues. I think the issue of low-income economies and their vulnerabilities are very well outlined, particularly on the issue of debt. Of course, these economies have faced significant increases in debt burdens, particularly over the period of tightening monetary policy over the past year. And many of these economies, of course, have been pushed into unsustainable debt positions, not only due to domestic interest rate rises, but also due to the impacts of their external holdings of foreign currency debt, in particular US denominated debt, which of course has implications for these economies as the dollar has appreciated over the past year or so. Ayaan has also very well outlined the major drivers of growth, which are of course under pressure in the next few years, including productivity, trade, and he has outlined very well some policy areas that could be focused on to enhance the prospects for these types of indicators. I think the main points around the report, given that context, firstly is on how to mitigate financial contagion. We had some, of course, volatility in markets over the past number of months and towards the end of last year as well. And mitigating financial contagion is clearly an important issue for emerging markets. And I think that to a certain extent, there has been limited spillovers, at least negative spillovers of financial stress that we have seen in advanced economies. This is partly, of course, related to improved macroeconomic fundamentals and enhanced resilience in financial sectors in emerging markets over the past number of years, which has helped. Nonetheless, economies must be, of course, vigilant to potential spillovers in this regard. Domestic macroeconomic vulnerabilities. Economies need to be really aware of problems related to excess capital outflows. And of course, one of the policy reactions that central banks in emerging markets have taken to negate the extent of net capital outflows during the period of last year was to increase the cost of capital. And, there is a sort of a trade-off between balancing net capital outflows through increasing interest rates against hurting the domestic economy through increasing the cost of sovereign borrowing, for example. And also, reducing the extent of excess currency depreciations, which has been effective to some extent. I think restoring fiscal sustainability is a key issue, which needs to be addressed in many EMDEs, as is very well explained in the report. Tax collection and administration needs to be improved. There needs to be much greater fiscal and public debt management capacity building in order to achieve those types of outcomes. But as well as that, I think we are currently at the stage where restructuring is of crucial importance for many of these economies, certainly in the near term. And there are a number of obstacles with prevailing restructuring frameworks that are in place, which Ayaan has mentioned in his presentation. And I think that, alleviating debt distress will be key as a result of that, and also strengthening the global financial safety net, which was also touched upon. Of course, there will be some differences in the extent to which economies need restructuring, and this will be driven by, of course, their levels of fiscal and public debt management capacities, combined with their levels of revenue collection capabilities. And I think that these issues are very well explained in the report. The report, I will also note, has a very interesting sort of a special chapter on the implications of US monetary policy tightening at the global level. In particular, given the shift in the Fed's reaction function towards inflation concerns is somewhat concerning for emerging market and developing economies, given that this can lead to some negative spillovers via the financial channel. Of course, The other channel which would be important would be if the Fed had been reacting for growth reasons, and these types of spillovers in that scenario would be perhaps more positive for emerging markets. So the fact that we are looking at tightening monetary policy and shifting reaction function of the Fed for inflation and inflation expectation purposes, emerging market and developing economies need to be concerned about that and need to carefully monitor that situation in terms of spillovers. Turning to a few comments, I have basically 5 comments. So the first one would be on the importance of global policy coordination in the current environment. I think that the report very well outlines the risks, as I've explained, and the challenges that the global economy faces. There are still short-term risks in terms of energy and food security. I think there has been some alleviation of these risks over the past few months. That's why I say that they're perhaps a little bit more short-term. If we consider longer-term policy coordination needed on, for example, accelerating energy transition, I think this is a key issue which could be perhaps delved into a little bit further in subsequent reports, particularly around the transmission channels of accelerating the transition and how that would be feasible in an environment of stressed fiscal positions in these economies. So I think that would be useful to examine in a kind of a scenario analysis going forward. I think the issue of debt and inflation has, of course, been very well explained. Inflation in these economies, of course, increases or leads to tightening monetary policy, and this can, of course, push the economies into unsustainable debt situations, as I've explained. And as well as that, it can also lead to scenarios whereby the transition to cleaner energy and achievement of goals on climate change can be hindered. So in this environment, of course, it's important to attract private investment. And when we have a sort of an environment of tighter financing conditions, it makes crowding in private sector investment much more difficult, of course. So it would be useful to understand how we can really leverage public policy to attract private sector investment in an environment of already stressed debt scenarios in many economies, in conjunction with tighter financial conditions at the global level. On the issue of, so the second point, third point would be on foreign currency denominated debt. So this is covered in the report very well. I think that's, depending on which EMDE region we are talking about, there are different exposures to US dollar denominated debt. For example, this is much more prevalent, for example, in the Latin American economies compared to Asia, for example, although, the level in Asia is still a significant amount. So I think one of the key policy issues to delve a little bit deeper into would be how we can really hedge against these foreign currency exposures. And of course, this is very closely linked to levels of financial development in local financial markets and their capacity to really enable hedging facilities to conduct and perform well by the authorities. So I think it would be useful to look a bit more about how this foreign currency debt could be hedged. On the issue of climate change, I've already sort of mentioned the challenges faced to crowd in private sector investment with public policy, which is sort of the goal of MDBs at the moment. There is obviously limited financing available from the public sector side, and it will be imperative to crowd in the private sector to enable the transition over the longer term. So I think it would be useful to look more deeply at how that can be achieved. And finally, I will have a point on capital flow management. I think that the report talks a little bit about the issue of economic fragmentation and some of the channels through which that can impact economies, particularly via trade and finance, of course. The economies can be subject to net capital outflows. Economies that are not directly connected to the economic fragmentation, but rather could be considered even as innocent bystanders. So a question would be to how to control for net capital outflows in that type of scenario. More recent research on the effectiveness of these types of measures have pointed to the role of the global financial cycle, for example, in some way mitigating the effectiveness of these types of measures. There's also new research to show that monetary policy in conjunction with macroprudential policy can be effective in some cases, but of course, it all really depends on the macroeconomic and financial development and fundamentals in the particular economy. So, yes, I think it would be just an interesting issue to look into a little bit deeper going forward. So that would be all my comments. I think overall the report really very well sets out the context for the challenges faced by global economies across different emerging market regions. It highlights a number of important policy areas that economies need to focus on, particularly on the fiscal side, which is, of course, very important, and taking into account challenges related to the achievement of global goals on climate. I think going forward, just in summary, I think some deeper analysis on how the transition to cleaner forms of energy can be achieved in the current environment of tighter financial conditions, issues around how to hedge foreign currency exposures, which is obviously amplifying the debt distress risks that economies are facing, particularly in emerging market and developing economies, some more than others. Debt restructuring is obviously an important issue. The G20 is closely trying to look at that and make some amendments to its common framework in order to alleviate the extent of some of these debt problems. But this is obviously perhaps, although it's very urgent, of course, it might not happen immediately. So greater urgency is needed there. And finally, the issue of capital flow management. I think more work would be very valuable in this area, particularly what we've seen in recent, over the past year in terms of capital flow volatility, reactions of emerging markets to tightened monetary policy in the US and the implication that has on their capital flow dynamics, and how they can also use capital flow management in an effective way, coordinated with other types of policies in the current environment of heightened geopolitical tensions and higher economic fragmentation, which is something, of course, we usually see in episodes following crisis events. And it's really about how to manage those risks effectively using the current suite of policies available. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for your comments. I think you raised 5 comments among many other issues: global policy coordination, debt inflation and private sector, foreign currency denominated debt, climate change and private sector, and capital flow management. So I would like to invite Ayhan to come in to share your immediate response to John. But before formally inviting Ayhan, I would like to encourage everyone watching the seminar to post your questions on the chat Q&A section. I see some people already posted the question, but I would really like to encourage you to post your question either in English or in Japanese. So with that, I would like to invite Ayhan to come in to share your immediate responses to John. Thank you.
Thank you, Koichi, and thank you very much, John. John picked up all the kind of the important points and raised critical issues. Let me quickly discuss some of them. So global policy coordination in an environment, of course, when you have multiple global challenges, and these challenges becoming increasingly pressing when it comes to how they affect societies. I talked about the climate change issue, also, of course, food insecurity, and this drive for fragmentation. When you put all of these together, you end up basically the factors that will ultimately have even weaker growth prospects in the medium and long term. Now, how should we address these? The only way to address these, look at the kind of the common denominators, and the global community focus on those common denominators and find solutions with the basic objective that everybody is going to be a loser if we do not address these problems. Another important problem is the debt issue John also mentioned. And on this one, we have written extensively over the years. And the big problem is to make sure the existing framework is working and working efficiently, working at a speed that is going to be helpful to these economies. And hopefully, we will see more action in that department soon. Now, the issue of energy transition critical in the bank. Our approach to this problem has, of course, global dimensions as well as the kind of the regional dimensions. But we have now climate change and development reports. We are covering as many emerging developing economies as possible. And for each country, we look at the link between climate change and development, focus on the risk associated with climate change, think through impact of that on other development or related objectives, and provide a rich set of basic policy recommendations. We have already released these reports for a number of countries. I think these are when we think about the climate change, really the reference reports for specific countries. At the regional and global level, we have work. Some of them we released already as an institution. We are looking at this issue when it comes to energy transition in the commodity space, what that transition means, and we have ongoing work on this issue. With respect to public-private partnerships and making private sector much more active when it comes to infrastructure investment, the climate-related investment, of course, these types of topics require more work. On the operational side, we have a number of initiatives in the context of our evolution framework. And on the analytical side, we have detailed work programs looking at analytical aspects of these challenges in the context of private investment, de-risking private investment, increasing private investment. As many of you know, foreign direct investment has been declining, and that has been a huge challenge for emerging market developing economies over the years, given the limited capital they have. Now, capital flow measures and how these measures can be helpful along with macroprudential measures and, of course, credible monetary policy frameworks. These types of issues, when you have this tightening cycle undergoing, become even more important. So far, we have not seen the type of, 90s, 80s style financial crisis in emerging market developing economies. We saw some, I think, serious financial stress episodes, the crisis in some frontier markets. We might see in coming months even more. So understanding the implications of these capital flow measures, how countries need to approach these measures under stress conditions, and to stabilize the inflows as well as outflows, going to be critical. At the end, the proof is in the pudding. We see implementations, and I won't be surprised more countries, resorting to these types of measures as we feel more the impact of tightening monetary policy. Now, the issue of how countries can reduce their risk with respect to currency. In some cases, these countries, of course, high levels of foreign currency debt has been a long-standing challenge. In the context of the bank, we are trying to bring, of course, this de-risking. So the removing certain types of risks when private and public entities think about investing in a country. But at the end of the day, fundamentals are critical, and the coherent macro policy framework, monetary policy being credible, independent, well-defined, with an anchor, and on the fiscal side, stable debt dynamics, clear medium-term programs, and initiatives when it comes to expanding revenues and increasing the efficiency of spending are critical. There are market-based mechanisms to hedge the risk, and some countries have been taking advantage of those, but some countries do not have the capacity to do that, or local markets are not, mature enough, as you mentioned, John. So all in all, I think this discussion was very helpful, and I'm hoping that we are going to bring more studies on the topics John mentioned in the coming months to inform the public and policymakers on these issues. Thank you again, John. Back to you, Koichi.
Thank you very much, Ayhan, for your comprehensive responses to the comment shared by John. Very appreciate. I'm sure John will now have immediate, again, responses to Ayhan. But let me read a question that we received from our audience. And then let me start with a question which was posted during the seminar. This is a question from Kodera-san. Thank you for your question. Thank you very much, Ayhan, for excellent presentation and your spring report on long-term growth. I broadly agree with your policy prescriptions for LDC and EMDE. The ones for long-term growth, including investment for human capital and digital economy, fit well for Japan as well. However, where is manufacturing industry? Can EMDE and LDC bypass this industry for long-term growth? Maybe my question is a bit too simplified. This was a question posted by Kodera-san. Thank you for your question. Let me actually read the question that we received in advance. Question from Sasaki-san. Thank you for your question as always. Question is this. How would you advise the leaders of African countries as well as the leaders of the smaller countries such as the Pacific Islands to navigate and gain recovery going through this difficult time facing with weak growth, high inflation, and debt situations? So question about the African countries and Pacific Islands. Perhaps Ayhan, I would like to invite you to come in to share your comment. And John, if you also have your additional points, after Ayhan, I'll also invite you to come in. Ayhan, please.
Thank you. These are two very good questions and critical questions, actually, policymakers have been discussing. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this Paris Development Forum, an important meeting point for global community to discuss these issues. And they discuss, of course, the role of multilateral institutions. Now, in the context of the manufacturing sector, this issue, when we think about Asian countries, manufacturing played a big role, how some of these economies really transformed themselves in the 80s and the 90s. Now, a number of emerging markets, frontier markets, have significant growth in services sector rather than manufacturing. Of course, services sector is quite different than the manufacturing sector. productivity tends to be lower, and associated with that, the job benefits have to be somewhat, smaller. So, but you see some countries have been taking advantage of growth in services sector. In fact, in the long-term growth prospects report, we discuss how services sector has become a significant engine of job creation, as well as an engine of growth in some countries. And of course, the services sector covers the financial services, the tourism, the banking services, the communication technologies. There's a broad array of jobs, and given the kind of the development in information technology, cross-border trade of these, these types of services has been increasing significantly over time, and pandemic played an important facilitator role when it comes to growth of the services sector. Now, what we have seen over the past 5 to 6 years, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the rise of fragmentation of trade networks. Because of that, we see progress when it comes to manufacturing sector has been accelerating in some emerging market economies, frontier economies. To what extent it will be transformative, it has to be seen. What is important at the global level, of course, we need to find ways to make sure trade remains as an engine of growth, whether that trade involves manufacturing trade or the services trade. And we looked at this issue again in the long-term growth prospects report. And the basic conclusion is that as much as trade does not contribute to the extent it contributed in the 90s or prior to the pandemic, it has still a huge role to drive economic growth as well as development. For that, both the global community and country-level policymakers have important roles to play. At the country level, basically removing impediments associated with trade facilitation, removing impediments on the border going to be critical, and having the type of infrastructure that basically helps countries within their borders to facilitate trade so it is easier to move goods from inland to the ports, to the kind of the borders. So they are, in a sense, much easier to transport to other parts of the world, critical. In many countries, we see huge challenges within country trade basically costs, and reducing those costs going to be an important driver of trade. At the global level, I already mentioned what needs to be done. Now, let me turn to the African countries and Pacific Islands. So in this report, we looked at the low-income countries' challenges. In the previous report, actually, we looked at small states, basically Pacific Island countries. The bank has been extremely active when it comes to challenges confronting low-income countries, challenges confronting small states. And an example of this, in our flagship report, Global Economic Prospects, we dedicate chapters to these countries and look in detail the types of challenges and policy measures, we basically need to focus on. So in the context of African economies, as well as these small states, it takes really a village to address the big problems they are facing. Global community needs to help. Needs to help in the context of debt challenges, in terms of having a framework, and needs to help when it comes to, necessary debt relief. Needs to find a platform to bring private sector, as well as large sovereigns that are now creditor countries, including China, playing active roles to address the debt problems. We are worried about these debt problems becoming a huge hindrance when it comes to progress in terms of development objectives. Beyond that, when it comes to the climate-related issues, we know that capacity and the financing not there in the context of small states as well as low-income countries. So the global community has to play an important role in helping these economies to be, in a sense, ready to the challenges associated with climate change. I already talked about how much larger fraction of society today facing climate change related problems in low-income countries, especially in fragile low-income countries. And this happened in a very short time period, in 3 years. So this does not necessarily mean that national policymakers can sit and wait. There are important things can do in the context of small state as well as these low-income countries. And the single most important thing, taking care of their house and making sure their house is in order. That means addressing these chronic fiscal problems and increasing spending efficiency, finding ways to increase domestic revenue mobilization, and basically implementing the types of policies that could translate higher growth, more stability. Now, the international financial institutions like the World Bank need to be very active. We are very active when it comes to low-income countries. We are very active when it comes to small states, both on the financing side as well as on the operational side and policy advice side. The pandemic, of course, has been a tragic event for these economies. For low-income countries, around 35% of them will not go back to the 2019 per capita income levels, even in 2024. In the case of small states, that number even larger. Fragile countries, even larger fraction of them will have basically a decline in their per capita income relative to pandemic, and they won't be able to overcome that even at the end of 2024. So what is critical at the end of the day, we need to be frank about these problems, magnitude of these problems, and we need to be very aggressive when it comes to solutions. Let me stop there, Koichi. Back to you.
Thank you very much. I would like to invite John to come in to share your views on those points. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Koichi-san. I think Ayan has very comprehensively covered the answer, but allow me to provide a few additional comments. So I think on the issue of manufacturing, investment in manufacturing, of course, one needs to consider the sectoral composition of the economy and the capacity for further GDP growth to be derived from manufacturing prior to making investment decisions. But I think that would be certainly something that would be possible given country-specific analyses. I think what's important in the current context is really the position of economies in global value chains and how susceptible they are to shocks as a result of that. For example, economies that may be participating backwardly in global value chains may be more susceptible to global shocks. So these are the economies, for example, that would be more involved in manufacturing closer towards the finished product, for example. So I think that's something that needs to be taken into account. On the issue of African economies, of course, Ayan has explained in his earlier presentation the issue of debt distress. Now, many of the African economies are, of course, the very economies that are in debt distress or at high risk of it. So I think debt restructuring is a significant problem and challenge for these economies, which needs to be addressed urgently. And of course, when those types of issues and challenges are overcome, then it can create an environment for greater flows of investment and development in terms of investment-driven outcomes as a result of that. On the Pacific Islands, I think that, as Ayan has mentioned, these economies were very drastically hit by the pandemic, and they're very much determined on tourism revenue in terms of its contribution to GDP. We will hope to see some return of that revenue stream in the coming years as we get further away from the pandemic. But I think more broadly, I think the advice would be for these economies in particular to seek more diversified revenue streams in terms of their composition of GDP. And this would make them, of course, less vulnerable to types of shocks that would impact a single sector, as we have seen during the pandemic.
Thank you very much, John, for your views. So, Ayhan and John, you responded to actually all the questions that we received in a very effective manner. So, before closing the seminar, I would like to invite Ayhan and John once again to share your final remarks, any messages that you may want to put forward before eventually closing the seminar. So, Ayhan, please come in.
Let me first thank you, Koichi, and all colleagues in our Tokyo office for organizing the seminar. Always great to interact with our audience in Tokyo. And let me also thank John for his interventions, always insightful, comprehensive. The challenges are quite significant, but I think the policy responses have been put by the policymakers in the context of monetary policy, financial stability. These interventions have been working. Let's hope inflation is going to come down faster than what we are expecting, and we will see better growth in coming months and years, better than what we are expecting. Let me end it with that positive note, Koichi. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. John, please come in.
Yes, thank you, Koichi-san. Thank you, Ayan, for the opportunity to make some comments on the GDP report once again. I found the report, as usual, to be very comprehensive and very insightful in terms of the outlook. I think there are clearly a number of challenges that we face in the near term and in the longer term. I hope that the challenges outlined, the nearer term challenges outlined in the report, will be mitigated by the time the next report comes out. And I hope that further progress will be made on reducing the extent of the longer term challenges that are outlined in the report as well. So thank you very much once again, and I look forward to seeing the next edition of the GDP report. I think it's in January.
Great. Thank you very much. We had Ayhan Kosei, the World Bank's Deputy Chief Economist and Director of the Prospect Groups, and also John Byrne, Vice Chair of the Research and Senior Research Fellow of the Asian Development Bank Institute. And then we featured the Global Economic Prospect June 2023 edition this morning. Thank you very much. We would definitely like to follow this tradition to future edition of the Global Economic Prospect. We hope next time we can have Ayhan in person coming to Tokyo to organize the discussions. But once again, thank you very much this morning, Ayhan and John. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. So we continue organizing the online seminars. Next week, on Friday, June 30th, we are featuring the report, Striving for Clean Air. This is going to be 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. On Friday next week. And also, early notice that I would like to share. The World Development Report 2023, one of the co-directors will be coming to Tokyo. And most likely it will be July 6 and 7. So we'll organize a seminar to feature the latest edition of the World Development Report 2023 edition. Most likely the seminar will be co-organized with JICA Research Institute. So please stay tuned. We'll post the latest information on our website. But with that, once again, thank you very much for connecting and watching our seminar. See you next time and have a nice weekend. Thank you.